Whenever you're unhappy, go to Russia. Anyone who has ever come to understand that country will be contented to live anywhere else. Today, we are talking about Russia in an effort to try to provide some context and some understanding for what is right now a regional war, but threatens to become a global thermonuclear war, threatens to become World War III. One of the things you need to really understand about Russia is that you as a Westerner are ill-equipped to understand Russia. Putin has referred to himself as a Christian. He is not a Christian in a way that any evangelical or Western Catholic would comprehend or recognize, not at least if they're serious about their faith. For him, it really is like Biden's Catholicism. I don't think it's real at all. But let's think about this for a second. Why would Russia's religious experience have such a profound influence on Russia's historical narrative? Well, welcome to another episode of Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton. And today we are talking about Russia. I am beginning a series on Russia, on Ukraine, on the war there, in an effort to try to provide some context and some understanding for what is right now a regional war, but threatens to become a global thermonuclear war, threatens to become World War III. And it seems to me that it would be helpful for us to try to understand something about these two countries, their history, their leaders, how we got to where we are. There's so much misinformation. Isn't that the word they like to use these days? Misinformation. But there's actually disinformation on these countries. And so I thought I would start, being that, my background is in European history, specifically Russian history, Marxism, socialism. Spent a lot of years studying that stuff. At the time, a lot of it, I hated it. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, I thought, probably never going to have any use for this other than in Jeopardy, watching episodes of Jeopardy. But what do you know? It has come full circle, and we've seen Marxist elements entering into our own society through BLM and Antifa. Antifa's more fascist, actually. And we've certainly have seen the rise of a new global fascism in what we see at the World Economic Forum. Those who are members of the posse will know that I've spent a fair amount of time talking about that. But Russia, I am preparing, as part of this series, I have been reading a number of Putin biographies in an effort to kind of navigate who this guy is, because the Western media narrative has been that he's crazy. I don't think he's crazy at all. I think he's crazy like a fox. But that is the Western media narrative, that he's nuts, and he clearly is not nuts. But by calling him that, it's almost an excuse not to do the hard work of trying to understand what motivates him. And I want to be clear from the outset of this series about Russia, about Ukraine, when I talk about Putin, when I talk about Zelensky, my motivations here are to help you understand and arrive at a conclusion on your own. I have my own opinions. Those opinions will be shared with you here. But my motivation is neither pro-Russia or pro-Ukraine. Indeed, it has been my position all along. I want to state this from the very beginning. I do not think the United States has any business in this war. I believe that this is a regional conflict we need to stay out of. I think there are victims on both sides of this. I think there are crazy people on both sides of this. I think there are corrupt politicians on both sides. And I want to also be clear that I think one of the most corrupt players in the entire war has been the United States, particularly under the Obama and Biden administrations, but also through Clinton, both Bush administrations. There's been a lot of nefarious stuff that has taken place, but that is getting way ahead of where we are today, where we're talking about Russia. One of the things you need to really understand about Russia is that you as a Westerner are ill-equipped to understand Russia. I have been reading this, or just finished this Putin biography. I don't know that you can really see it here. Try to get it in the light so that you can see. The title is simply Putin. And it's by Philip Short. And Philip Short is a journalist of the old school, and I think the book, his biography, I think is generally very, very good. Well, one of the things that Short does throughout the entire book is that he insists that Russia is European. And I have to disagree with that. Russia isn't European. Now, there are plenty of Europeans, plenty of Russians who are Europeans, but there are plenty of them who are not Europeans. They're Asians, and that is because Russia is Eurasian. It's not strictly, it straddles two continents. And as a result of that, it's neither one nor the other. It is a mix of both. And that means that you know, it's like a child of mixed nationality parentage. It often means you're straddled between two worlds, and you're never fully one or the other. You're a bit of both. And that has its advantages, but it has the massive disadvantage that you never neatly fit with the culture of either. And that has been the case with Russia. I begin with this quotation here from the Marquis de Custine, a Frenchman who was traveling Russia in the 1830s. He said this: whenever you're unhappy, go to Russia. Anyone who has ever come to understand that country will be contented to live anywhere else. So you can see he did not have a very high opinion of Russia. Winston Churchill called Russia, quote, a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Meaning he was stating right at the outset, this is not a country we as Westerners are really able to understand with the Western mind. P.J. O'Rourke, having a little bit of fun with that. P.J. O'Rourke, by the way, he is deceased. I don't think the man was a Christian. I'm not sure. He wrote for Rolling Stone back when Rolling Stone published some really good stuff. He was an economist, and you would think economists can't be funny. There's a joke that goes like this. A woman goes to see her doctor because she's not feeling well, and her doctor says to her, I have bad news. You have 6 months to live. And she says, is there anything I can do? And he says, yes, you can marry an economist and move to Idaho. And she says, will I live any longer? And he says, no, but it will feel like eternity. P.J. O'Rourke did not fit into that category. P.J. O'Rourke is hilarious. And you can go and read some of what he has written on Russia, on anything actually. His Parliament of Whores is very funny. His book on Russia, which is called Eat the Rich, which was published in the mid-90s, still is very relevant. And it's witty, it's worth reading. But he said this, having a little bit of fun with Winston Churchill's a quote there. He says, Russia is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma, tied in a hanky, rolled in a blanket, and packed in a box full of little styrofoam peanuts. Russia is just hard for us to understand. And to the Western mind, it is impenetrable. As I say here, Philip Short, his argument is they're Europeans. No, that is part of the problem, is that Europeans often in their negotiations with Russians, their interactions with Russians, is they make that fatal assumption. And then they don't get to the result they hope to get to because they have misunderstood who Russians are and the way Russians think. Again, it's Eurasian. So it's not strictly European. It's not strictly Asian. So, French and Germans and Italians and Spaniards and Brits, for all of their differences, which are significant, they have far more in common with each other than Russians have with any of them. And that is because their historical experience is wholly different. It is incredibly different, as I will explain in just this particular episode. There's a Russian poet, Tyutchev. He wrote this in 1866, but it's so true. He says, not with the mind is Russia comprehended. The common yardstick will deceive, engaging her, so singular her nature. In Russia, you must just believe. Some years ago when I was in St. Petersburg, Russia, not Florida, I remember having coffee with a Russian woman who said this to me about Russia. She said, you know, Russia is like a child with a disability. You just love it that much more. And I thought that was such a poignant and honest assessment of her own country. She's acknowledging we're a very broken people, a very broken country. Our history is very marred, but it just makes us love it that much more. Now, let's talk a little bit about the nature of Russian history. You know, I've just asserted that their history is very different from our history. Now, what makes it so? Why is that the case? And your thinking is shaped, all of our thinking is shaped by our historical experience in ways we scarcely understand. You're a, how do I want to put it? There's kind of a generational thinking, as it were. I've also referred to something on the show that I call generational wisdom. You know, in talking about the making of biscuits, for instance, that skill can be lost, or carpentry, you know, or whatever, if those skills aren't handed down. And it's hard to relearn them because you're trying to acquire a knowledge, a wisdom that was acquired over the course of, you know, possibly centuries, certainly generations, and it's just almost impossible to achieve that. But we're all inheritors of certain ways of thinking that are sort of built in to you in ways you don't really understand. Now, those of you who watched the episode, we did an episode, I think it was last year, on the film Sound of Freedom. Which is about child trafficking in South America. And I had my daughter, Sasha, on. That episode has loads of views. And I had my daughter, Sasha, on to discuss that because Sasha, we adopted her at the age of 10. She was almost 11 when we adopted her from Ukraine. And one of the things, what I'm talking about right now, was very evident with Sasha because Sasha had been abandoned at birth and raised in 3 different orphanages for the first decade of her life. And there are certain things that our biological children, our 3 sons, understood not just about life in America in a way that works, which was one thing, but they also had an understanding about how a family works, just things that you haven't taught someone in the sense of, you know, sitting down with a notebook and a blackboard, but where they just kind of absorb it. They just kind of learn it. And so here was Sasha having the disadvantage of coming to America and coming to our family without any of that. And the result was that there was a kind of a comedy of errors that you had to be ready for with Sasha. In my book, The Grace Effect, where I tell her story, I compare Sasha to Eliza Doolittle. If you've ever watched what's that film? My Fair Lady. Pygmalion is written by George Bernard Shaw and made into the film My Fair Lady. And insofar as Sasha didn't understand some of social expectation that our children, again, we'd never, you know, explicitly taught, they just observed and picked up on and knew. And she didn't have that. And it's because she wasn't the recipient of the same intellectual traditions, ideas. Hers were very different. And because she hadn't grown up in this country and hadn't grown up in our family. And so that was new. Eventually she'd get there, but it would take a while. And in a similar sense, this has also been true of entire nations. And in this case, we're talking about Russia. This also applies to Ukraine as well. But they are inheritors of a completely different intellectual experience as a result of their history. As a result of their history. And I want to give you another example. I don't want to sidetrack myself too much, but it's been on my mind. Trump and Gaza. Trump and Gaza. As those of you who will watch this show will know, I want to see us succeed. I want to see this administration succeed wildly. I'm very skeptical of his plan for Gaza. And his plan for Gaza, I don't know if you've paid attention to it, but it's very much the way Trump thinks. He looks at that and he goes, you know what? That could be an extraordinary vacation spot on the Mediterranean. It really could. He says, let's just right now it's a wasteland, let's turn it into the next Riviera. I think that's completely unworkable. I think that's so naive to think that will work. And here's the reason why. It assumes that Palestinians want that Arabs want that. Many of them do not. And the first 4 seasons that gets built there, they will blow it up. That's just the way they think. One of the fatal flaws of American foreign policy has been the assumption that other people think the way we do. And I would argue that American foreign policy has been marred frequently by the naive assumption that every conflict is a result of a misunderstanding. This is why a lot of Americans believe, both left and right, Democrats and Republicans, after 9/11 thought, what did we ever do to these people? What in the world? Why do they want to blow up our buildings? What's their problem with us? We don't have anything against these people. What's going on? What's that have to do with anything? And there were those who kind of took this attitude like, if only we could sit down with Osama. If only we could just sit down with him and have a conversation, I'm sure we could work out our differences. Osama bin Laden understood very well what the United States was, and he called it the Great Satan. He hated America and what it represented. And it's not because he didn't understand America, he understood it very well. The same applies, I think, to Gaza. I'd love to be wrong about that, by the way. I would love to, in future, be going on vacation to some kind of French Riviera-like resort in what is now the rubble of Gaza. But I just don't think that's ever going to happen because I just think there are too many people, they don't want that. They prefer the rubble. They prefer to burn it all down because this is the way they think. Now, as that applies to our understanding of Russia, it is important that you, from the very outset, that you need to understand that the Russian historical experience is not the same as our historical experience any more than the Chinese or the Vietnamese historical experiences like our own. And the result is it has led to a different kind of thinking, not necessarily better or worse. Sometimes better, sometimes worse, sometimes neither, but different. And you have to understand that because the American way of thinking is progressive, not in the lefty sense of progressive, but is progressive in the sense that we believe that we're seeking to move through life and sort of better ourselves. Not everybody thinks like that. Some people think, I'm moving through life to one day become a martyr. It's what I want to become. Or I want to die for Mother Russia, or, I want to burn Teslas. There are just some people who think like that. And it's important that you understand that the Russian experience is very different. And part of the reason has to do, I'm going to lay out just some general principles for understanding. You cannot, as an old professor of mine, Oxford University's M.R.D. Foote, Michael Richard Daniel Foote, one of the biggest takeaways I ever took from him is the importance of geography. The importance of geography in shaping a nation's history. The United States, our history, when we say God shed his grace on thee, the fruited plain, the waves of grain, America has been blessed with geography that almost no nation on earth can boast. We have had either, if Mexico has been at times hostile to us, they have been incapable of projecting power against us because they're a weak southerly neighbor. Our neighbor to the north, in spite of the things that we've seen in recent years, that's the longest undefended border in the world. And traditionally, it has been that way for a reason. There might be reasons to change that now, but it has traditionally been a very, very peaceful and positive relationship between the United States and Canada. And then we have these marvelous anti-tank ditches called the Atlantic and the Pacific. And the result of that was that, for example, in America's early first century, of our country, while France was a much greater power than, this fledgling country called the United States of America, the fact of the matter was Napoleon had no ability to project power across the Atlantic. And so he could claim that he owned the Louisiana Territory all he wanted. But while he was claiming it, Americans were chopping down trees and building log cabins on it. His best option for him was to sell it while he could get some money out of it before he just lost it. Again, that's a result of geography. If Napoleon's armies had been positioned south of our border or north of our border, if that had been France, I dare say we would not have the Louisiana Territory today. But geography played a huge role in that. And so America could sort of expand at its own rate. And you can get into all kinds of discussions about whether or not you think our nation's history is sinister and that sort of stuff. I'm not going there in this particular episode. That's not what this is about. Then you have countries like, say, Belgium, the Netherlands, who have terrible geography. Why is their geography terrible? Because they have been a doormat for invading armies. There's a joke in Belgium and in the Netherlands that says that, why they have street lights? So that when the Germans invade again, they won't have to march in the dark. Not because they were particularly interested in Holland or in Belgium, but because they had to go through them to get to France. That's where they were going. And they took that route 3 times between 1870 and 1940. 3 times they did it. Let's hope that that's the end of it. But again, their geography, Switzerland blessed with great geography. Great geography. Switzerland could afford to declare itself a neutral because it was going to be a bloody, bloody campaign for anybody seeking to take that country, situated as it is in the Alps. And their people are trained to fight in the mountains. It was not going to be easy for Adolf Hitler, or it wasn't going to be easy for the Kaiser. It wasn't going to be easy for anybody. And that's because their geography lent itself to being easily defensible. Russia has terrible geography, no natural borders to hide behind. There are no Alps, there's no Rockies, there's no Pyrenees behind which they could hide. And the result was, contrary to the way we think of Russia today as the aggressor, Russians see themselves very much as the victims of Western aggression. And that's because for centuries, they were invaded from the West many times. The most recent of which being, of course, Operation Barbarossa, June 22nd, 1941, where Hitler sent 175 divisions, 4.5 million men across the Russian frontier. For Russians, that history is very recent. It is very fresh. They were also invaded from the east, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But the point is, their geography did not permit them, it did not lend itself to stability. And that's because they were constantly fending themselves off from invasions from either the east or from the west. When your country is a doormat for invading armies, stability is not typically a luxury that you can afford. You just don't have it. So Russia's geography has been very, very much a handicap for Russia. But more than that, its geography has been bad also because of its extreme northerliness. And that has been difficult for crops, for feeding themselves, and hence the reason that Russia has had a historic dependency on its breadbasket, which is Ukraine. Ukraine. You see, so geography plays an incredibly important, and by the way, another country blessed with geography, though they themselves have destroyed it, is Britain. The English Channel has proved to be a near insurmountable, it's 20 miles across the English Channel, but those 20 miles may as well be 1,000,000 miles, because no one has been able to successfully invade it until they started importing mass, immigration since 1066, since William the Conqueror did it. Operation Sea Lion, Hitler toyed with the idea of invading Britain, but he never got around to it, and that's because the Battle of Britain was never able to achieve Luftwaffe supremacy in the air. They couldn't do it. But so geography has lent itself to a very different historical experience for the Russians from us. Our historical experience, very different because of our geography, in part. Another reason is because the history of the West tends to be very, very linear. We are moving through one phase, to another. If you were in my Western civilization classes, we would be talking about, at least economically, we would be talking about things like, say, the barter system and moving from that to a feudal system, and then moving from that to, early stages of capitalism and so on. Linear. We'd be talking about feudal monarchies. We would be talking about constitutional republics and all these very linear, progressive with a lowercase p. Russia's history tends to be very cyclical. Leonidas, the novelist, written such books as Trinity, QB7, some other big ones. He said this, he said, Ireland has no future, only the past, repeating itself over and over again. That can be said of Russia. Russia's history tends to be very, very cyclical. They have been in, it's like if you've ever driven a vehicle across mud that has dried, it's very hard to keep out of the ruts that are already there, and the wheels get pulled down into them. That's Russia's history. They keep constantly being pulled back into the same ruts. And those ruts tend to lead towards totalitarianism. That's the direction they're moving, incrementally towards now. They're not totalitarian right now in the sense that they were under Stalin. Life is much better for the average Russian right now than it was, say, in 1948. But they're still a totalitarian system, and we're going to talk about that more when we get to Vladimir Putin. So, various historical patterns emerge for Russia. And let's just by way, it's part of the reason I'm standing, in order to illustrate some of what I want you to understand when it comes to Russia's history. There has been this perpetual oscillation between westernizing. And again, this is because Russia geographically is Eurasian. It's not strictly European. You don't find this tendency in America or in Western Europe, or for that matter in Asia. But you have this tendency between a desire to westernize, and then there are those over here who are drawn to going back to the old Russian ways, what we call Slavophiles. The Russians themselves are ethnically, they're a Slavic people. And so there's a group that historically has been referred to as the Slavophiles, lover of all things Slavic. We want to go back to that. That's what we want. So that Russia has been torn between these two tendencies. And I could go back a very long way in Russia's history in order to illustrate this, but I'll just do it by starting with Catherine the Great. Okay, so Catherine the Great, she's German. She's German. She comes to Russia. She succeeds her husband onto the throne of Russia. She becomes, as we know, Catherine the Great. And she comes to the throne in 1762. Catherine was very much a product of the Enlightenment, and she was a westernizer. She was determined to westernize Russia and to bring it into the future. Into the present, actually. She died in 1796. She was followed by her son, Paul, who hated her, and he ruled from 1796 to 1801. He was murdered in 1801, and he was a Slavophile, and he tried to undo everything that his mother did. He tried to undo all of her westernizing tendencies and policies and take Russia back to where Russia was before. He was followed in 1801 by his son, Alexander I. You know of Alexander I if you've ever read or watched one of the movies War and Peace. He was the Tsar of Russia during the Napoleonic invasions. He was quite clever. But guess who educated him? His grandmother. And so he was a Westernizer. He's on the throne from 1801 to 1825. He was trying to make Russia something more like a constitutional a monarchy, like Britain, say. Not exactly, but more in that direction, with a slightly more despotic bent to at least the Western mind. He died in 1825. He is followed by his half-brother, Tsar Nicholas I, who was educated, his education was overseen by his father, Tsar Paul. He was a Slavophile, and he tried to take Russia back in that direction. He was on the throne from 1825 to 1855. He is followed by his son, Tsar Alexander II, known as the Liberator Tsar. He did one of the most remarkable things in Russia's history. He liberated the serfs, the peasants, if you will. They're really more or less slaves. And he did it in 1861. And the Russians like to point out, hey, we liberated our slaves before you did in America, which came in 1865 at the end of the American Civil War. This month, actually, April. American Civil War ended, what was it, April 9, 1865. So they love to point out, hey, this was a huge achievement accomplished by Alexander II. But he wasn't radical enough in the changes that some of the rising socialists wanted to see happen, and they blew him to pieces in 1881. He was on the throne from, from 1825 to 1855 as Nicholas the first, and then Alexander II from 1855 to 1881, 1861 is when the serfs were liberated. 1881 is when he was assassinated by socialist revolutionaries. He's followed. Alexander II is followed by Alexander III, who was, guess, a Slavophile. Going to take Russia back in the direction, not towards Europe, but more towards Asia in terms of its policies and its cultural leanings. He was on the throne from 1881 until 1894. And he was known as the kind of the Russian bear. He was a big man. And he was followed by his son, Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, who was on the throne from 1894 until 1917 when he was overthrown. And then he and his entire family, Olga, Maria, Tatiana, Anastasia, and Alexei, and his wife, Alexandra, were all executed in July of 1918 in the Ural Mountains. And Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, was also kind of leaning in the direction of a Slavophile. But the point is, you can see this oscillation back and forth, this almost schizophrenic nature of Russia, that it's neither strictly Western and it's neither strictly Asian. It's Eurasian. And as a result, it looks somewhat schizophrenic. And by the way, that would continue straight through various Soviet leaders. I mean, there were some Soviet leaders who would look like Westernizers, Khrushchev in some sense. By that I don't mean that Khrushchev was a Westernizer in the sense that Catherine the Great was, but he recognized we must either adopt Western standards and technologies and industry, or we will forever be a vassal to the West. Putin recognizes this also and has tried to modernize Russia, to catch up with the West, America in particular. Otherwise, you will always be subservient to the West. So there's always been this duality to Russia's nature, to Russia's character, and it has never been overcome. They have never been able to become truly Western or truly Asian. They have always been both, and it appears they always will be. And this is the cyclical nature of Russia's history. It's important that you understand that. So that's one of the historical patterns that emerges. Another is Russia's perpetual backwardness. Russia's perpetual backwardness and reluctant modernization, which the Slavophiles tend to, kind of take them in that direction. But another reason for that has been just simply because, let's take, for example, something like the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution began, the earliest rumblings of the Russian Revolution began in the Industrial Revolution began in the 1740s in Britain. So the Industrial Revolution began in Britain. It was spread throughout the Western world. Do you know when the Industrial Revolution really hit Russia? The 1930s, with the 5-year plans. And even then, so they're a full 2 centuries behind the rest of the West. 2 centuries behind the West, and they've never caught up. They have never caught up. China is trying to catch up and is not there. They are trying to get there. And by the way, I want to say this. China is very, very clever on social media. They are putting out via these, I'll call them social media tech farms. They are putting out video after video after video that show, here's Chinese school children. Look how orderly and clean they are. Here's this phenomenal bridge that's built across this, this gorge. Have you seen the things I'm talking about? Incredible things of an automobile or something that show China as a highly, highly advanced and sophisticated civilization. It is brilliant propaganda, and that's what it is, propaganda. It doesn't mean that that bridge doesn't exist over that gorge, or that that car doesn't actually exist, or Chinese school children don't look beautiful. It just simply means that it's not a, it is a sliver of their society that's meant to deceive you in believing this is what the whole looks like. China's a third world country. Shanghai, having been to Shanghai makes any city in the West look third world. It is so high tech. But if you get outside of Shanghai, you get outside of Beijing, you get outside of the major cities, it's third world. I mean, it is massively third world. Just a part of China is not. And the same is true of Russia. Russia really is a third world country. Moscow is phenomenal. St. Petersburg, aspects of it are phenomenal. But generally speaking, it is a third world country. And Russians who are watching this will be offended by me saying this. It is true. I've been in your country many times. Same's true for Ukraine. Doesn't mean there aren't some very remarkable and beautiful things, but it is not typical of the whole of the country. Perpetual backwardness has been a problem for Russia. Peter the Great, who was well before, he died in I think he came to the throne in 1682 and he died in 1725. So, he was a good, say 40 years, almost 40 years before Catherine the Great, 37 years before her. Peter the Great is known as the Great Westernizing Czar. By the way, I would highly recommend reading, if you haven't read it, Robert Massey's superb book, Peter the Great. He also has a great one called Nicholas and Alexandra. Massey died just a few years ago, but he was terrific, a Russian historian, and those books you'll thoroughly enjoy. They're quite excellent, both of them made into movies, but you really need to read the books. But Peter the Great recognized when he became czar, he recognized that Russia was massively behind the West. And so what he did is something really quite unique. He went on a tour of the West. And he did so pretending, which is hilarious. Can you imagine Trump or Keir Starmer? He might be able to get away with it since a lot of people probably wouldn't know who he is, or Giorgia Meloni, or any president or prime minister or national leader, Xi, going around the world incognito and thinking no one knows who he is. But this is what Peter did. Peter pretended to be like a nobleman who was on tour, but he had this huge entourage with him and everyone knew who he was. I mean, it quickly got around. This is the Tsar of Russia who is touring Western Europe. And part of what Peter was doing is he was trying to unlock the secret of the West. What is it that invigorates the West and makes the West, that animates it, and that has catapulted them so far ahead of my own country? How do we do that? How do we catch up? And so Peter spent a lot of time going throughout the West, hiring as he went shipbuilders and engineers and educators and architects and you name it, and bringing them back to Russia with the goal of modernizing Russia. Trying to graft Western Europe onto Russia, like a skin graft, it didn't work. But it was admirable. You understood what it was that he was trying to achieve it. And those efforts have continued straight from Peter, from 1682 all the way to the present time. Putin is currently trying to do something fairly similar in a different way. He's not Peter the Great, but in a somewhat similar way. Another historical cycle that has emerged that Westerners cannot relate to and do not understand is that Russia's history has a cycle of extreme brutality and suffering. Extreme brutality and suffering, that it just beggars the Western imagination. We have nothing comparable to it. Nothing. And it precedes Stalin, and under the czars, the suffering, the famines, they're not necessarily state-induced, but and the fact that Russia's a police state, and these things go together. Peter Struve, a Russian statesman, he said this: the basic difference between Russia and Europe is this: the omnipotence of the political police. That has not been true through our history. There's been efforts to change that. There's efforts to move us in the direction. I think Britain is already there. Britain has become a police state. Some countries in Western Europe are becoming that very rapidly now too. But Russia has historically been a police state, whereas Western democracies have typically been governments with state police. Russia has been a state police with a government. You see the difference? So there's a massive difference in this regard. Another huge difference is that in the West, the Russians will brag of having a constitution. It's meaningless. And ours is moving that way too, sadly. We're starting to see, the left wants to create a judicial oligarchy where you're seeing, judges exercising what is essentially executive power, which is not what has been given, to the judiciary. But that's a separate conversation. But in the West, the United States in particular, historically, again, there are efforts to change this, but historically, we have been a constitutional democracy, meaning that the Constitution itself is the law of the land, and every government and citizen is or should be subject to it. Russia, however, it's reversed. The Constitution is beneath the government, and the Constitution is quite malleable and changeable, and is changed to suit whatever it is that they want to do. So for instance, in the case of Putin, more recently wanting to continue to serve as president, they just changed the Constitution. Just like that, boom. So they're a government with a constitution, not a constitutional government. You see, so these are huge differences. But coming back to the extreme suffering, let us take, for instance, World War II. Of the roughly 50 to 55 million people killed in World War II, roughly half of them were Russians. Think of that. More Russians died in the Battle of Stalingrad than Americans died in both World War I and World War II, Vietnam and Korea together. More Russians died in St. Petersburg than Americans died in those same wars. Just in those two battles, separately, not together, separately. Russian suffering has been on a scale that beggars the imagination. The result is that it has often created a very brutal people who are, and this is true of Ukraine, most of what I'm saying here actually applies to Ukraine, because those two countries, they're like Siamese twins. They may want to get away from each other, but they'll never be able to. No operation is going to be successful in separating them. That is the very sad news. It's the reality. But I'll get to that in a future discussion. The Russians themselves have been subjected to such extraordinary brutality and suffering that result is that it often creates a brutal people, and or a people who just accept the suffering as just the way it is, that it's just life. It's a country where people will tell you that to call the police, this is where Americans can be quite naive, as someone will tell you in another country, gosh, a taxi driver nearly raped my girlfriend. You say, have you called the police? And the people in many other countries around the world, Russia is one of them, will look at you like you're such a naive American. To call the police would be to make it worse, not better. You're just better saying nothing. You're just better saying nothing. It's a very, very different world. It's a very, very different way of thinking. And Westerners would do well to understand that when it comes to Russia. Why is their historical experience so different? Well, we've touched on geography, but I want to talk about two things that we'll call the Russian disasters. There are two great Russian disasters that have led to this massive difference in the way they think. The first is the adoption of Greek Orthodoxy in 988. I talk about this in my book. I have a little fun talking about it in my book. The Grace Effect. But in that year, Prince Vladimir, now this is according to Russia's oldest native historical source. It's called the Primary Chronicle. It was recorded by monks who made various entries, over the course of centuries, recording Russia's history. And according to the Primary Chronicle, in that year, 988, Prince Vladimir of Kiev, see, this gets at that Siamese twins problem. You know where Russia's first capital was? Kiev in Ukraine. Russia, it'd be like saying that America was founded in Mexico City or in Ottawa. That gets at, you begin to see part of the problem with how the two countries, Ukraine and Russia, are linked, because from a Russian perspective, Ukraine is part of Russia. Anyway, many Ukrainian, by the way, would dispute that, but I'm just want to be clear that is the whole of Putin's argument. When he sat down with Tucker Carlson, laid out the history, that was the whole of his thesis. We do not recognize Ukraine as a separate country. Anyway, in 988, Prince Vladimir of Kiev, of Rus, as it was called at the time, decided, paganism doesn't quite do it for us anymore. We need a new religion. We need to catch up. Everybody else is getting rid of paganism. Why don't we too? And so he sent out emissaries to investigate the major religions of the world. So he sent those to investigate Catholicism, Judaism, and Islam. And they came back to give him his report. You can picture him sitting in a throne and listening to them as they lay out the various options available at the time. And by the way, and there was a fourth, and that was to investigate not just Catholicism, but Greek Orthodoxy. They weren't exactly separate yet. The formal schism hadn't happened, which comes in 1054, where the Greek church splits from the Latin church in that year. And so you have Rome, and you have the Greek Orthodox Church centered at Constantinople, modern day Istanbul. But anyway, here are these emissaries who come to report to him. And it's really quite funny. You can read this in my book, The Grace Effect, or you can read it in the Primary Chronicle, which you can find online. But you have those who went to see Roman Catholicism come along, and they report to him what that looked like. And he listened to them very carefully on what they had to say, and heard their their arguments, you have to pay allegiance to Rome, they tell him. And he's like, not really keen on that idea. And then you have those who investigated Judaism. And they tell him all about their faith, their law, and what they're about. And then they mention circumcision. And he's like, excuse me? And they say, you'll have to have your foreskin, lopped off. And he goes, well, homie, don't play that game. Okay, what's the next one? And then he hears what those who investigated Islam had to say. And they tell him that he can't drink, that in that religion he can't drink. And he says, and I quote, which is hilarious, drinking is the joy of the Russes. Drinking is the joy of the Russians. Man, they were getting lit even back then. So the idea you can't have vodka, not doing that. So then he hears those who went to Constantinople and they saw Hagia Sophia. Hagia Sophia, one of the marvels of the world. And they said, when we saw it, when we entered into it, we knew not whether we were on earth or in heaven. God surely must dwell there, they said. Europe didn't have anything that was equivalent to Hagia Sophia. Hagia Sophia is, have you ever been in Istanbul? Now's not a good time to go. But Hagia Sophia it's been said that the dome looks like it's suspended by a golden chain from heaven. And it's because while domes were being constructed at that time, the problem was that the domes frequently, in order to support them, they either had columns supporting them or there were, how shall I put it, since I'm not an architect and don't know all the architectural terms, buttresses and things of this nature. You couldn't get light into them because windows weren't really possible. You needed all the support that you could get to hold up a massive dome. Hagia Sophia, built by Justinian, who, upon its completion, walked in and he looked up and he said, "O Solomon, I have surpassed thee." He was making reference to the building of the temple. The Hagia Sophia has 40 windows at its base, which makes it look like, how in the world could this, it stood now for over 1,000 years. How in the world can this massive dome be upheld? With 40, meaning in its interior, most cathedrals, many of them built much, much later, hundreds of years later, to go inside them, it's dark and damp and cold. Hagia Sophia is flooded with light. And it's incredible. And, the Ottomans trashed it. They whitewashed. Now they've uncovered a lot of the mosaics and such. But anyway, you could well understand where some primitive types coming from Russia walk into that place and go, oh my gosh, God must surely dwell here. And they report this to Vladimir and he goes, that's for us. That's the religion for us. And so, under penalty of death, he required Russians to be baptized. I don't think he quite understood what was meant by sword drill. But anyway. Now, why is that a disaster? Why is that one of Russia's great disasters? It's a disaster for Russia because it forever separated Russia culturally and linguistically from the West. I really want to underscore this point. This more than anything else that I'm talking about has led to the huge difference between Russia and Europe, between Russia and the West. All the cataclysmic changes came through the Latin Church. And by that I mean things like the Renaissance, the Reformation, the so-called Enlightenment, the Scientific Revolution, the Industrial Revolution. All of that came through the West. Russia missed all of them. Think about that. Russia never had a Renaissance, never had a Reformation, never had an enlightenment or a scientific revolution, and it has barely had an industrial revolution. They missed all of those things. And all of those experiences together collectively had a massive impact on Western thinking. We are heirs. Even if you've never heard of the things I've just mentioned, you are heirs to that kind of thinking. That thought has been handed down from you through that historical experience. Part of that historical experience is also why Westerners, particularly Americans, think of history as progressive, that we're moving from a simple thing to a more complex thing, kind of like evolution. That you start out poor and you become rich, or you start out small and you get big, whatever it is, that we're moving to something better than where we were before. It has led to traditionally Western Europeans, though this has changed hugely, and Americans tend to be very optimistic people compared to Eastern Europeans or Asians. We tend to be a naive and optimistic people. We tend to believe, yeah, we're down now, but we're coming back. I often joke, I'm an Alabama football fan. And being an Alabama football fan, those people who don't like Alabama football will say that Alabama fans are arrogant, and I get it. I know why they say that. But I think part of the reason is because if you're an Alabama football fan, it's like being a Yankees fan. It's meaning even when your team stinks, and your team might be bad for a decade, you're coming back. And the reason you do is because you're Alabama. It's just what we do. The Yankees are like that. I don't care. They can go a decade or 2 decades or 3 and suck. But they're coming back because they're the Yankees. And my point isn't that you have to like my team at all. My point is just simply saying that if you're an Alabama fan, you're typically optimistic even when you're down. You'd have a losing year and you go, it doesn't matter, we're coming back. We'll win we'll win a bunch more national championships because it's what we do. We won them in the 20s, we won them in the 30s, we won them in the 60s and 70s, and one in the 90s, and then reeled off 6 more, or whatever it is, in the 2000s. We might be down now, but it doesn't matter, we're coming. That's what it's like to be an American. If you're not an American, you need to know that is typically the way Americans think. Yeah, okay, it's the Carter years, we stink right now. It's like the Whitworth years. He was a coach at Alabama when they really stunk. We're down now, but we're coming back because we're Americans. It's just what we do. Russians don't think like that. Western Europeans, for the most part anymore, don't think like that. Asians don't think like that. That has to do with we are heirs to an intellectual tradition where we have been blessed with the absence of so many of the things that Russians have suffered. It's the kind of thinking that is charmingly naive that Trump looks at Gaza and goes, we'll make a resort out of it. I mean, I do love that in the sense that it's such a positive, upbeat, charming idea. And that's because we can't penetrate the thinking of someone who says, I really want to blow that up. It's not the way, unless you're burning Teslas, it's not the way Americans tend to think. Not everyone in the world wants the same thing as you. Not everyone in the world wants to be an American. Not everyone in the world wants to be a Christian. Not everyone in the world wants what you think makes for a better life. And usually that's because, not always, but usually it's because their historical experience has created something very different in them. And this you must understand when we are talking about Russia. Russia's religious experience is wholly different. Putin has referred to himself as a Christian. He is not a Christian in a way that any evangelical or Western Catholic would comprehend or recognize, not at least if they were serious about their faith. Not at all. For him, it really is like Biden's Catholicism. I don't think it's real at all, and I'll explain that when I get to Putin. But let's think about this for a second. Why would Russia's religious experience have such a profound influence on Russia's historical narrative? Well, even though the West has largely abandoned God, the Western religious experience has shaped the West as we know it. It has catapulted the West ahead of the rest of the world militarily, technologically, and culturally. It's just a fact. And that has to do with the way Western minds were shaped by religion, specifically by the Christian religion. Let me illustrate. Now, I have a stack of books here just to illustrate what I'm getting at here. Let me move my laptop out of the way. So, what we have right here are books that represent the pinnacle of Catholic thought. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, the summary of theology, roughly 4,000 dense pages of theological writing where he is attempting to, as it were, summarize the mind of God. Published in the 13th century, Aquinas was an intellectual. Very much worth reading, by the way, and I know 4,000 pages, I doubt any of you are going to take that on, but you can read passages of it, and of course, I'm pretty sure it's out of copyright. So I think you can get it for free online. I think you can. It's been a while. In it, you have, for example, this is just by way of illustration of just how profound, how deep was Aquinas' thinking here. He sets out to prove the existence of God, the so-called 5 ways, the 5 proofs of God's existence. And one of them, he uses physics to illustrate the existence of God. He essentially says this. It's what's called the primary mover argument. And do understand that I'm simplifying an awful lot. I mean, this is a podcast, and I don't have time to unpack all of it. But he uses physics, and he essentially says this. It's the primary mover argument, and he says that everything in existence was set in motion by something else. I mean, an object at rest remains at rest unless it is acted upon by an outside force, right? So he says that with any object, you have something that preceded it that sent it in motion. And you have an infinite regress with all objects, whether you're talking about the universe or you're talking about yourself. You have an infinite regress where you go back in time and you have to eventually come to a fixed point and to a primary mover with a capital P and a capital M. And for Aquinas, that was God. He said there must have been a primary mover who set it all in motion. So 4,000 pages. Aquinas' summary of theology. Next we have, and I have actual copies of this, we have John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion. 1,700 and roughly 60 pages in the final edition, which was published in 1559. He first published it in 1725, and then he would continue, 1735 or 36 is when he first published it. Let's see, he was born in 1509 and he published it at 26 years of age. Yes, 1535. And he would expand it over the course of his life, and then the final edition was published in 1559. He died in 1564. And it's extraordinarily deep. In it, Calvin lays out the Protestant version of this. The mind of God. How we might understand. Calvin, by the way, was trained as a lawyer and he was trained as a classicist. If you look at his notes, his references, like Aquinas, superbly educated. You don't have to agree with him, but superbly educated. And by the way, he makes it very hard for you to disagree with him because he offers so much evidence and his footnoting is so superb. But in it, he's laying out a Protestant understanding, what he thinks is the biblical understanding of life, who God is, of the really contentious doctrine of predestination, which isn't even central to the it doesn't come until book 4. There's been much made out of that is more than what Calvin himself actually said or argued. But again, it's extraordinarily erudite. This is the sort of thing that you can sit down and you read a few sentences, a paragraph, and you need a little while to munch on it because of its depth. Now we come to the Russian equivalent right here. There isn't one. There isn't one. The Russian Orthodox view, which is derived from the Greek Orthodox view, would be only an arrogant Westerner would think that he could summarize the mind of God. In the Russian Orthodox view, God is unknown and unknowable. Calvin's thinking led to the rise of, according to Max Weber, the German sociologist, his thesis, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, published in 1904, Weber argued that the rise of capitalism was a result of Protestant, specifically Calvinist theology. Why? Because he says that Calvin had taught, that Protestantism taught, that the accumulation of wealth was not a bad thing, as some Catholics had argued, but it was a sign of God's blessing, and therefore was a worthy pursuit. It also taught, contrary to some Catholic teaching, not all, but some Catholic teaching, that any work that was honest was honorable. And therefore, the stable boy could take pride in his work as much as the king or the prince in his own. That had a massive impact on the development of the West. It changed the way people viewed work. It changed the way people viewed the accumulation of capital. It led to the rise of capitalism. That is the reason why Weber argues, and I think it's irrefutable, that post-Protestant Reformation, you see the rise of Protestant powers like Britain that would dominate a quarter of the Earth's surface, the Low Countries, America eventually, in the decline of Catholic powers. Spain vanquished, a very quick war with America, the Spanish-American War, where America would lop off Spanish colonies. You see the rapid decline of France. You see the rapid decline of Italy, and also the rise of Germany. So Weber would say the difference was what was going on up here, how they viewed the accumulation of wealth, which led to the rise of capitalism, which took off in these countries, and the other ones remained somewhat socialist and backward in their thinking. Russia didn't experience any of that. You see? So these are huge, huge differences in thinking. And Russia has not been affected by any of them. And one of the reasons is because the Bible was first translated into English in 1382 by John Wycliffe. He had his followers who were called Lollards. That was a derogatory term used for these people because they met in house churches, and as they're reading, because many of them were illiterate and learned to read through the Bible, they're speaking aloud as they're doing it, saying, they're Lollards. These are people who talk funny. They read funny. They're not erudite. What also happened in the West that would change things hugely? The invention of the movable type printing press. Printing presses had existed, but the movable type printing press came in 1455. And that meant the proliferation of information, specifically printed Bibles. Do you know when the New Testament was first published in Russia? 1818. Almost 500 years after the first English language Bible was published. First Russian language New Testament, 1818. So Russian Orthodoxy has often been tied to a kind of paganism because the text of Scripture has meant less than the teaching of the church, which may or may not be biblical. And that, by the way, is true of any religion. God gave you a Bible so that you can reference it, so that you can look at the rules. It's like your Constitution. If your government tells you to do something, you go look at the Constitution and say, well, it's not what it says. I do have a right to bear arms, for instance. I do have a right to free speech. Same with your pastors or other teachers. If they're telling you to do things that aren't in the text, you need to question it. But see, Russians didn't have access to the text. They didn't have it. It wasn't there for them. It wasn't available for them. And the result is that many have argued that Russian Orthodoxy has always put an incredible stress on not the here and now, but the hereafter. That there's a profound otherworldliness to Russian Orthodoxy, that this world is just a place where we suffer, and we're spending our time here in a waiting room in order to get to heaven. And the more you suffer, the more treasures you lay up in heaven. Whereas the Catholic and the Protestant views have not been that. The Western view of God has been very different. God's knowable in the Western view. He's whether Catholic or Protestant, he is knowable. You can understand him. You can discover him. You know, what was it that Kepler said? The great scientist Kepler, he said, science is the process of thinking God's thoughts after him. It's a wonderful thing to say. It's such a Western Christian way of thinking. There's a reason why the scientific revolution came in the West and did not come in China. It did not come in Russia. It did not come in South America. It came in the West because they believed that God had created an orderly universe and he invited you to study it. Know me. What is a theme that runs through Scripture? Seek and you shall find. It's not just said once, it's said repeatedly. Seek. Seek me. Find me. He invites you. He lays down breadcrumbs. That's the Western view. God is knowable. His creation, he has given us dominion over it. This is the Western view. And yes, we're all seeking to develop our souls in a relationship with him in a process of justification whereby we're saved and sanctification where we become more Christ-like, but he wants us to have dominion over the here and now and to make this world a better place. That's not the Russian view. And while a lot of Russians today are not Christians, because the Soviets, 75 years of atheism demolished, literally in some cases, Russian churches, tens of thousands of Orthodox priests and others executed. Many Russians over the course of those 8 decades abandon any kind of belief in God. But they remain beholden to that way of thinking. I mean, where did they lay Lenin? In a mausoleum, like a saint. I've seen his body many times. It's just mostly wax these days in Red Square, just outside the walls of the Kremlin. But even Russian secularism has the trappings of religion. And this otherworldly quality to Russian thinking that says the here and now, we just get through it in order to get to heaven. But the problem for Russia has been that the West has advanced at such a pace, at such a rate, where the technology, interestingly enough, Philip Short's book about Putin, he talks about Putin in the 1990s and early 2000s, realizing that almost everything that was being created in Russia was crap. Who says to themselves, oh, I have a Russian watch. What I'm wearing right now is Swiss. Swiss. And I'm saying that having a little bit of fun, but what I'm trying to say is, to say it's Swiss or German or Japanese, it's well made, it's quality. No one says, well, I'm wearing right here, this was made in Nigeria. I'm wearing my fancy Libyan watch, my Russian watch. What in Russia is made that is great? Caviar, but they don't manufacture it. Mink, sable, they don't manufacture it. Raw materials, yes. But one wouldn't say that Russia makes great cars. The old Top Gear is hilarious, where they do comparisons of old Russian cars, which is so funny. It's very funny. You know what? The Russian mafia, what they do not drive? Russian cars. You know what they do not wear? Russian watches. You know what they do not use? Russian phones and computers. And you know what their girlfriends wear? Not Russian fashion. They take them to Rome to shop, and they take them to Paris to shop. I've seen them lining up outside of Dolce, and I think this is, forgive me, I myself have never shopped at any of these, so ladies, you'll have to tell me. I think it's called Dolce and Gabbana. And what's the other one with the LV on it? Louis Vuitton. And those places, I've seen them. These are shops in Paris and in Rome where they're so expensive, they only let you come in, like you and your wife, like a couple or two at a time, and then they lock the door behind you. That, you know, imagine a store like that where what is for sale in there is so expensive that you can actually stay in business by selling to customers just one at a time. So they lock the door behind them, show them around, let them look, they buy something, they leave, they let the next customers in. Same with if you go into the Rolex store, which I have in these places, you come in one at a time and they lock the door behind you to make sure you're not taking something and stealing and running out with it. But the product is so expensive that it works. The model works for them. Russians don't want Russian stuff. When I first went to Russia in the 1990s, you know what I took with me? Blue jeans. I'd been told, and it was true, take tennis shoes and blue jeans and you can get anything in Russia. And it's true. You could swap them for rubles, but who wants rubles? You could swap them for cigarettes. I don't smoke cigarettes. You could swap them for anything in a tight. If you're in trouble, offer some blue jeans. Offer some, a pair of Converse or Nike shoes. They'll go a long way. This is less so in Putin's Russia, but it remains true that they don't want Russian goods. They don't. And this is because they have been behind the West. And part of the reason for that is because at 988, the West went this way historically, and Russia went this way. And being forever linguistically and historically separated from the Western experience. And now, because of the holdover of Russian Orthodoxy, Russian thinking, while being often very otherworldly, they do recognize we don't want to become a vassal of the West. The second great disaster for Russia was the Mongol domination. The Mongols galloped onto the Russian steppe in 1240, and they remained for 240 years. They weren't driven out until 1480, and that had a massive impact on Russia. As an old Russian history professor of mine at graduate school liked to say, the Mongols brought nothing of imitation to Russia except their methods of warfare. The Russians mimicked them in everything except warfare. And that is because the Mongol domination, there's now efforts to try to rehabilitate them and seem like they were these very sophisticated people. They were very sophisticated in their tactics of warfare, but they were a brute people, incredibly brutal people. And they didn't much intermarry or mix with the Slavic peoples, but they did dominate them for more than 200 years, and that left an indelible impression upon Russia and brutalized Russia and took Russia very much backward culturally from much of the West. It was a huge setback for them. Again, imagine that. They were dominated for occupied for 240 years. So these are two huge, huge disasters in Russia's history that they've never really recovered from. And so the result of this has been that Russia has always seen themselves as trying to catch up to the West. They have always seen themselves as a people who are perpetually on the defensive from the West. We think of them as something like Klingons, as these highly aggressive people. They do not view themselves in quite the same manner. And I'll throw out this little morsel as I close that just gives you a little clue of where I'm going with Putin. I read Putin as a guy, at least on this score, as a guy who wanted the West. He wanted to be seen, he wanted Russia to be seen as an equal partner in the West. He wanted to be seen as European. And when Americans did not treat him like an equal, did not treat Russia as an equal for reasons that made sense, by the way, he decided, if you won't accept me as an equal, as a friend, as an ally, I will make you respect me as an enemy. This has been another episode of Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton.